Hello. I just want to say I really enjoyed this class. I'm a huge history buff, so it was a cool experience to do the Rheinstraat game, and I really liked it. But today I'll be focusing on presenting on the Austria and focusing on the question of how Austria remembered the Austria-Hungarian Empire. Um, and that really comes down to the collapse in 1918. Although it did collapse, the legacy was still quite there. I mean, not just in Vienna's architecture and culture, but in politics, identity, and how Austria sees itself within modern Europe. Um, Basically, the main overall argument is whether or not the Austrian memory of the empire has changed over time rather than staying the same, which I agree. I 100% believe it has changed over time. But right after World War II, the empire was remembered basically through collapse and the trauma that followed. But far later, Austria began to reshape its identity, eventually reviving parts of the imperial past in a far more positive and cultural way. Um, and that's usually linked to unity and multiculturalism. And in the collapse and inflation aspect of things, and kind of the memory of the empire, we kind of have to understand that the aftermath of the empire's collapse, it fell apart, but it didn't completely just go away. There was a newly formed Austrian Republic, although it was small, insecure, and quite economically fragile. I mean, it was unable to do really anything to match the big dogs when it came to superpowers. And Harold James explains that the economy it quickly spiraled into severe inflation, similar to what Germany experienced. And basically, money lost value overnight. Prices skyrocketed, and common everyday life became almost unlivable and unstable. And this left a very lasting negative association with the end of the empire. Instead of a nice, fuzzy, warm remembrance for the Habsburgs, it was more of a remembrance of decline, crisis, and the bringing of uncertainty in a time that it was really needed. And Austria remembered the empire mainly as something that collapsed, but also something that needed to be moved beyond, not recreated, something that needed to be not necessarily forgotten, but taken as a grain of salt, if you will. And the intellectual identity side of things, and basically Austria as a separate state from Germany. As Austria moved further away from the war, national identity became far bigger of a topic. Who were we? Who are Austrians now without an empire? Are we German? Are we Czech? Are we Italian? That was the big question that was popping in everyone's minds, and something that everyone needed to know. We need identity. We need nationality. And Peter Simons helps us explain this kind of transition that Austria kind of went through, the intellectual life, and how thinkers in Austria began to define themselves in distinct ways. And it contrasted drastically from German philosophy. So it was quite easy to see who the Austrianness were, and it was all facilitated by universities, writers, philosophers, scholars, and whatnot that aided in this separate version of a Habsburg culture that was once a Habsburg, now a full Austrian. Um, and so we can really see the big changes come in when we talk about migration. Um, the next major when it came in after 1945, Austria brought in guest workers, especially from Turkey, former Yugoslavia, and these refugees arriving during the Balkan War really kind of were an immigrant population that became far more diverse because they repopulated with the Austrian populations and themselves. And Albert Krahler actually helps us kind of explain this, and he kind of tells us that half of the migrants in Austria came from family related reasons. So, showing it was a long term demographic shift. Instead of a temporary labor flow, it was a far different thing. And the Habsburg legacy, the reason it was so ingrained was it was a multi-ethnic empire. It had many languages, many cultures, many religions, all under one crown. So even though modern Austria was much smaller and far less wealthy, it was still, through migration, it was a negotiation of multicultural identity. And so that integration and belonging was still needed and existed, but they were still kind of fighting whether or not they needed a monarchy. And so heritage and imperial memory really kind of stand out because it kind of has a resurgence, and it kind of has been more recently, and giving Austria-Hungary a new meaning. And it's far more positive and cultural. Instead of focusing on collapse, Austria now highlights the empire as a part of its heritage, Habsburg part of its past. And Matt Sandrin discusses European unity and how nations use history to fit themselves in Europe's story. And Austria has done just that by using the Habsburgs and reframing them instead of a domination period of time. It's more a time of multicultural existence. And Brendan McDonald research helps us states how often claims past empires how often claim past empires symbolically. In Austria's case, the empire has a cultural brand, and seen in Vienna, tourism, palaces, music. It's all nostalgic of old Austria. And lastly, we can just truly just ask again, how was this all remembered? Um, And so, yeah, so basically we're returning to that question. And the answer is that the memory changed dramatically over time. It was slow in the beginning, but it hit a very steep downhill, and it changed drastically. And in the early post-war period, the empire was linked with the collapse and the hardship and kind of trying to step away from the empire. But as it focused on rebuilding and the intellectual and demographic changes, it helped revive a new identity and helped it reflect on its imperial diversity, but create a new Austria that was separate from the Habsburgs' legacy. And in short, Austria never forgot the empire. It reinvented what it meant to be an Austrian through Habsburg past. And from the trauma to reflect on the selective nostalgia of rather than trying to rebuild something that collapsed, they created something new and a new modern Austrian identity that has flourished today. Thank you.